For many, Illinois conjures up images of cityscapes and agriculture, but a remarkable amount of biodiversity can be found throughout the state with a little determination. Located approximately in the center of the United States, Illinois is where north meets south and east meets west. Extreme northern Illinois has boreal forests, like those more common to the north, whereas extreme southern Illinois has cypress swamps, like those in Louisiana. On the western edge of the state are dry grasslands on steep terrain called hill prairies, and eastern Illinois is the boundary of the deciduous forests more common out east. Plants common farther north, like bird's-eye primrose and American larch, are at the southern edge of their range in northern Illinois, while plants common farther south, like copper iris and bald cypress, are at the northern edge of their range in southern Illinois. And plants more common in the dry western grasslands, like blue sage and Missouri coneflower, are at the eastern edge of their range, while species more common in the eastern deciduous forests, like wild azalea and cucumber magnolia, are at the western edge of their range. And central Illinois is the heart of the tallgrass prairie.
Join me, Chris Benda, aka Illinois Botanizer, to learn more about the natural beauty of Illinois and what it's like being a practicing field biologist.
Illinois contains 14 different natural divisions that are further divided into sections. And in 1976, a landmark survey called the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory, or the INAI, began to identify, evaluate, and catalog the remaining biodiversity of the state. This endeavor was initiated due to the efforts of George Fell, the founder of the Natural Areas Movement. George successfully championed the visionary idea of a state law that allowed for the permanent protection of land in Illinois, a program implemented by the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission. George was the commission's first director and also founded the internationally renowned organization called the Nature Conservancy, along with his wife Barbara, who was as committed to nature preservation as he was, and whose support made their nature aspirations possible. George observed acre after acre of destruction of the iconic Illinois prairie and was inspired to act. With just 0.07% of the land in Illinois in a pristine natural condition, he stated, "We are living at the time of man's final conquest over the wilderness. What we have saved and what we may save in the next few years will be all the true wild nature that will remain to pass on from generation to generation in the years ahead. There will never be another chance." He seized that chance, and today there are over 600 nature preserves in the state, and many other states have modeled similar natural area programs after Illinois. He belongs in the company of renowned nature preservationists like John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt, and you can read a biography of his life by Arthur Melville Pearson called Force of Nature. Many other biologists and nature lovers fought to save the remnant landscapes that remain in Illinois, and we owe them all a debt of gratitude. And although relatively little of these remnant natural communities persist, I proclaim the wise words of E.O. Wilson: "Every scrap of biodiversity is priceless, never to be surrendered without a struggle." Here are some examples of the biodiversity found in Illinois. Hill prairies occur along the major rivers in the state, like the Illinois and the Mississippi. Substrates can be comprised of loess, gravel, glacial drift, and sand. Cypress tupelo swamps comprise the extreme southern end of the state. Trees found farther south are common in this habitat, such as bald cypress, water tupelo, water hickory, water elm, overcup oak, swamp chestnut oak, American snowbell bush, and others. Seeps are interesting communities as well. Acid gravel seeps occur in the Cretaceous hills of Pope and Massac counties, while others are alkaline. Called calcareous seeps and fens, these wetlands were created by glacial activity and have a constant flow of cool, calcium-rich water, and only certain plants are adapted to these harsh conditions, like Calms lobelia, grass of Parnassus, skunk cabbage, and marsh marigold. Flatwoods are a forested community type that occur on clay in both the northern and southern parts of the state. The clay substrate creates an impermeable surface, causing water to accumulate and create ephemeral ponds that support wildlife like central newts, other salamanders, and tadpoles. Perhaps the most imperiled community type is the savanna, as very few high-quality examples exist in Illinois. Here, one can find neat plants like savanna blazing star, purple milkweed, and bur oak. Lastly, Illinois is called the Prairie State, as it is the heart of the tallgrass prairie ecosystem. More on that later in this video. I'm fortunate that my work takes me to these places, the highest quality parts of Illinois. People often ask me what it's like being a biologist, so I'd like to show you some of the experiences I've had working as a botanist in the field. My love of nature started a little later in life, as I began my biology degree at age 23. As I learned more about the natural world, I was driven by one simple question: what is that? Having grown up mostly ignorant of the plants and animals in their natural environment, I was curious to know what all the organisms are. And my first love was wildflowers. At the University of Minnesota field station in Bethel, Minnesota, called Cedar Creek, I had my first summer biology job and met a friend that could name most of the common wild plants by their botanical names. I was fascinated by that, and I was hooked. I began my deep dive into botany and never looked back. I moved to Illinois in 2004 to pursue a master's degree in biology at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and had recently been given a small digital camera I could fit in my pocket. I began to photograph, identify, and label all the wildflowers I could find in Lake County, where I did my research. The first season, I had well over 300 species observed. And while my foremost interest was always in plants, I branched out and studied wildlife for my graduate degree. I spent 3 years researching the reptiles and amphibians of Illinois, specifically Blanding's turtles, Emidoidea blandingii. These charismatic animals are rare across their range, which is mainly centered around the Great Lakes, with extensions to Nebraska, Massachusetts, and Nova Scotia. I was out in the field nearly every day that first summer, trapping turtles and tracking their movements with telemetry. By the end of the study, my colleagues and I had documented the largest population of Blanding's turtles in Illinois. However, the best job I've ever had, and the one that catapulted me to understanding the natural heritage of Illinois, was working as a regional ecologist for the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory Update in 2008 to 2012. This survey was similar to the one conducted in 1976, and for a variety of reasons, a careful re-examination of the state was warranted. I was tasked to evaluate the southernmost 19 counties in Illinois for new natural areas, which are places that are biologically significant, mostly in terms of natural quality of the natural community and the vegetation present. By the end of the project, I drove 56,828 miles, took 33,727 photos, and spent 632 days in the field to document 685 potential natural areas, of which 50 were recommended for nomination to the Natural Areas Evaluation Committee. My experience exploring the habitats of southern Illinois and learning the vegetation present within them led to the opportunity to teach the flora of Southern Illinois at Southern Illinois University in 2012. This class was created by the legendary botanist Dr. Robert Mullenbrock, the authority on the plants of Illinois and author of The Vascular Flora of Illinois. It is an honor to instruct this course and to inspire the next generation of botanists. Since then, I've worked with a variety of agencies and institutions, largely as an independent contracting botanist. Here are a few of the more memorable experiences I've had. A few years ago, I was contracted to conduct an inventory of fens in Missouri, mostly in the Mark Twain National Forest. The fens in this area are remote, and it took a bit of hiking to reach some of them. But once we got to the site, we were rewarded with a splendor of rare and restricted plant species, like Riddell's goldenrod, rose pogonia, small fruit primrose willow, and showy lady slippers. We visited several fens each day, and while camping each evening would investigate the specimens we collected that day, identifying them and placing them in the plant press so they could later be curated as herbarium specimens. Through this project, we also had the once-in-a-lifetime experience where we paddled a canoe down the stream from Greer Spring to the confluence with the 11 Point River. This area contains rich aquatic flora and is strictly off-limits to all recreational use. The Forest Service was documenting the biota of this high-quality area, and we inventoried the vegetation at several springs and fens along the way. Also that year, I was hired by Argonne National Laboratory to conduct fieldwork in Hawaii. My colleague and I were tasked with conducting avian and vegetation surveys at a military installation where restoration had occurred in order to enhance the habitat for endangered Hawaiian birds like stilts and coots. This research is ongoing, and I get to travel to the island of Oahu several times a year to do this work, and of course, enjoy the beach. Another partnership I've enjoyed is working with the Nature Conservancy crew at Nachusa Grasslands in Lee and Ogle counties. Nachusa Grasslands is the result of an idea to restore a large tract of land by acquiring a few small remnant natural communities and restoring the land in between them. The result is a 4,000-acre preserve that now harbors bison and the grasslands they depend on. A visit to see these magnificent animals is worth the trip. My work at Nachusa Grasslands involves teaching the staff and volunteers about plant identification through wildflower walks and touring the natural areas in that region.
I'm at Nachusa Grasslands in Ogle County, and I am on my third attempt to find this wildflower in bloom, and lo and behold, here about 6 o'clock, I finally found it. This little pink wildflower right here is called Femaranthus rugispermum, and it's one of the fame flowers. And they like sand and rocky outcrops, and it only blooms for 1 hour each day.
The last project I'd like to highlight is measuring state champion trees for the Illinois Big Tree Register. The University of Illinois Extension Forestry specialists maintain the register, which is a list of the largest specimen of each of the 184 native tree species found in Illinois. With funding from the Illinois Forestry Development Council, I was able to visit 40 champion trees throughout the state, including some very impressive ones, like a sycamore in Sangamon County, sassafras in Macoupin County, a flowering dogwood in Jefferson County, and a cherry bark oak in Johnson County. Unfortunately, several of the champion trees I visited to remeasure were dead, like the water tupelo along the boardwalk of Section 8 Woods Nature Preserve in Pulaski County. But the well-known bald cypress at the lower Cache River boat landing, formerly the largest tree of any kind in the state and now number 2, still stands, and it was a fun one to remeasure. What determines the largest tree is a score that encompasses 3 measurements. The circumference in inches is measured at 4.5 feet above the ground, and the trunk size typically contributes the most points to the total score. If the specimen is in the water, still measure the trunk 4.5 feet above the ground, and in the case of this bald cypress, that measurement was 34 feet in circumference, which is 408 inches. Next, measure the height of the tree in feet. This is most accurately done with a digital rangefinder, but it can also be done in various ways with the little trigonometry. The bald cypress measured 66 feet in height. Lastly, measure the spread of the canopy in feet. Where possible, place a stake in the ground under the extent of the canopy on one side and measure the distance to the extent of the canopy 180 degrees from there. Then measure the extent of the canopy extent in the opposite direction, 90 degrees from the first measurement. Take the average of these 2 measurements and divide it by 4 to get the point total for the canopy. The average canopy spread of the bald cypress is 36 feet, so 1/4 of that is 9. Add all 3 measurements together to get the total. So 408 plus 66 plus 9 equals 483 points. By the way, currently the largest tree in the state of any species is a huge cottonwood in Ogle County with 491 points, but I have yet to see this champion. Now I work for the Plants of Concern program in Southern Illinois, which is a partnership between the Chicago Botanic Garden and Southern Illinois University, and it is a citizen science effort to monitor rare plants.
As a botanist working in Illinois, I have the pleasure of being outside in beautiful natural areas almost all year long. And while this is an amazing way to make a living, it's not without its challenges.
One thing to not be cavalier about is protection from ticks. Ticks are an unavoidable part of working in the field, and while some tolerance for dealing with these critters is necessary to enjoy the outdoors, there are a few things to keep in mind when preparing for the field.
So what are the first things you want to do when getting ready to go out in the field? Just to make sure that you have clean footwear. So I have my rubber boots here, and there's a little bit of mud there that's kind of caught in the tread. So I have this nice pick brush tool that I really like. So you can really work in there. Look at that, whole big chunk came out that time, and really make sure you clean all the mud out. You know, the mud can have little seeds that stick to it, and it may be for an invasive species, and we don't want to be moving seeds around unintentionally. So make sure you get them nice and clean, and you brush them out a little bit, brush on the top side, you know, perhaps get them perfectly clean and ready for the field. So always have clean footwear. So here are some tips for dressing for field work. I like to wear light colored clothing so you can easily find ticks and remove them. I wear 2 shirts, have an undershirt that soaks up all the sweat, and then I like having a lightweight long sleeve shirt over the top for extra protection. Of course, I always wear a belt, and I have my shirt tucked in, also preventing ticks from gaining entry. And then here at the bottom of the pants here, I have what are tick gaiters. So it's basically just a gaiter that wraps around the cuff of your pants and keeps everything nice and enclosed so there's no ticks crawling up your leg. Of course, that also protects with the mud and keeps your pants a little cleaner in that regard. And then of course, a field hat is important. I like to represent the Illinois Native Plant Society an organization of which I am a life member and am very passionate about. And lastly, of course, you always have your handy loop or the hand lens conveniently located around your neck. And sometimes I call this the nerd necklace. So you use it to nerd out on plants and look at very small features up close. So there you have it, dressing for the field.
However, no matter what you do, insect bites are bound to happen. And one year, I had a bout of chigger bites so bad that I wrote this poem. Oh why do there have to be chiggers? For a reaction in me, they sure do trigger. The many little red bites feel like braille, and when they itch, they make me want to wail. If you like evolution, then you must love the chigger, for they would not be as bad if they happened to be bigger. But an invisible invertebrate has all the advantage, and leaves me with little else than to put on a bandage. I guess I could prevent them by staying on the trail, or if I took more time to scratch them with my nail. I could spray myself with nasty chemicals and DEET, or stay inside altogether and beat the summer heat. But that is not my style. I was born to explore, to see the nature and learn from it more. Plus, if there were less chiggers, there'd be more tourists, and it would be impossible to be a nature purist. In addition to ticks and chiggers, mosquitoes can sometimes be abundant, and they can make focusing on the task at hand more difficult. I remember one day conducting vegetation sampling for AES in the east woods of the Morton Arboretum, where the mosquitoes were so fierce I had to wear a head net. I joke that my tolerance for wearing a head net is usually less than my tolerance for mosquitoes. I've had some run-ins with caterpillars too. Some of them have bright colors and tufts of hairs that sting when touched. These are to be avoided, but sometimes when they hide under a leaf and you brush by it, they can give you a painful sting.
I was just walking through the woods, brushed past this leaf, and felt stinging hairs on my leg. Ouch. So I turned around, looked underneath the pawpaw leaf, and there it is. Saddleback caterpillar.
Spider webs can also take some tolerance to deal with in the later part of the summer. I joke that I don't mind the webs taller than 6 feet or less than 5.5 feet, but they always seem to get me in the face. This is one reason why I carry a handkerchief, so I can clean the webs off my face. Someone once asked me how I deal with all these elements, especially during the hot and humid days of southern Illinois, and I said that honestly I get so focused and motivated about what I'm doing that while I do notice it, I carry on, driven by finding rare and neat plants in the wild. And it's all worth it, because I get to have amazing experiences finding cool and rare organisms like this very rare mud plantain.
Oh, cool, look at this. Right down here.
Woo! It's the kidney leaf mud plantain, Heteranthera reniformis. And this is the first documented population of this year for Alexander County. This is a Illinois endangered species.
I also enjoy finding neat animals, particularly snakes. Of the 40 species of snakes that inhabit Illinois, 4 species are venomous. This includes the state endangered eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, which is a rattlesnake that inhabits prairie. Because natural prairie is now rare, so are these snakes. In southern Illinois, there are 3 venomous species, and it's not unusual for me to observe at least one individual of each kind in a given year. Copperheads are the most abundant, but the most elusive as well. They have excellent camouflage. Cottonmouths are more restricted in their distribution, occurring only in the swamps of extreme southern Illinois. These gentle snakes are all show and open their mouths as a defense posture. Always remember to leave snakes alone, and they will leave you alone, as bites are rare and often on the hand, presuming the person was trying to grab the snake. Another venomous snake species, and my favorite, is the timber rattlesnake. I've had the fortunate experience of encountering 30 of these gorgeous creatures in the last 13 years living in southern Illinois. They deserve to be revered, not feared.
Here is another rattlesnake, number 6 for the year. Nice big sucker. Didn't even see it. Just started rattling before I could even do anything. Oh yeah. Going into the defensive posture. I'll leave you alone, buddy. Illinois botanizer here in Alexander County, Shawnee National Forest. Oak hardwood ecosystem. Looking for rare plants. Happen to instead encounter a rare animal. Timber rattlesnake. Perfectly nestled down in the leaf litter, sticks and mud. Almost walked right past it. Crotalus horridus.
Another incredible snake experience I had was coming across a plain-belly water snake in the birthing moment. Some snake species lay eggs, called ovipary, and others birth live young, called vivipary. As you can imagine, there can be a large benefit to being mobile after leaving the womb, but it's also more taxing on the females because they form placental attachments to the young while in the womb. One final reminder to leave snakes alone when encountering them in the wild. Another benefit of my work is getting to interact with many other amazing biologists throughout the country. I've had a varied work history botanically over the years, and the variety is one thing that keeps me interested and motivated to work in the field. Now, I'd like to discuss one of my favorite natural communities in more detail, and that is the Illinois prairie. Hi, I'm Chris Benda, and I'd like to share with you a little bit about the Illinois prairie. Before Europeans began to settle in Illinois, there was vast prairie as far as one could see. Naturalists and writers of the day like Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, and Henry Allen Gleason knew about the uniqueness of the prairie landscape and made efforts to see it. They gazed upon prairie plants that were common then and now rare, such as eastern prairie-fringed orchids and white ladyslipper orchids. And Illinois was wet. Before large-scale drainage projects, Champaign County had a water table 7 feet higher than it is today. But in order to convert the rich organic prairie soil into the most productive farmland on earth, the water needed to be drained and the ground plowed. The invention of the combustion engine and mechanized plow fueled one of the largest conversions of land on the planet. The prairie was so vast that few people imagined it could almost all be destroyed, and even fewer bothered to care. Illinois is called the Prairie State, yet very little high-quality prairie remains to this day. Of the approximately 36 million acres in Illinois, 22 million are estimated to have been prairie. According to the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory, now just 2,200 acres, or 1/100% of the original Illinois prairie remains intact. Or to put it another way, of the 57,915 square miles of land in Illinois, just 1 square mile of high-quality prairie remains. But what remains is a priceless aspect of the rich biological heritage of Illinois, the Prairie State. Interest in prairie preservation in Illinois began in the 1960s and 1970s, led by Dr. Robert Betts
George Fell, and Jack White. When they searched for high-quality prairie remnants, many were found in pioneer cemeteries. Although Leopold wrote about the cemetery prairie in his Sand County Almanac, Piccoons only conversed with the dead, for he had seen the fate that had befallen the prairie, and noticed that the hoary piccoon, a conservative species that does not tolerate environmental damage, only grew in pioneer cemeteries, prairie ground set aside in the late 1800s as burials for European settlers who died trying to make a living out on the prairie. These small cemeteries are almost all that remain of the expansive prairies that once blanketed the Grand Prairie Natural Division of Illinois.
I'm here at Loda Cemetery Prairie Nature Preserve in Loda, Illinois. And this is one of the gems of the remnant prairie landscape left in the state of Illinois. Of course, one of the sad facts about Illinois, the prairie state, is that there's very little prairie remaining. It's important to realize that there are many different types of prairies, and dolomite prairie, gravel prairie, and Loess Hill prairies, and black soil, silty loam prairies, and sand prairies. So many different types, and depending on many factors, some may survive easier than others. Particularly the black soil prairie is incredibly rare in Illinois because it's such productive farmland, and so there's very little of that particular substrate prairie, the black soil, remaining in the state. But Loda Cemetery Prairie here is one of the remaining examples, which another reason why it's a true gem of our priceless biological heritage. This site has an interesting history in that it was Pine Ridge Cemetery, and most of the burials were done along the road, sort of in the front of the property. And that area has some pine trees, mostly spruce, which is peculiar, but it's pretty much been covered in lawn sod, and it's mowed and manicured pretty intensely. So little prairie vegetation exists in the cemetery itself where the gravestones are, but the Cemetery Association owned land behind the cemetery that was pristine, intact, never been plowed Illinois prairie. And in the late 1970s, during the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory, Jack White instructed his biologists to look at cemeteries in the prairie region of Illinois to see if there was any prairie vegetation and any high quality, remnant natural prairie occurring in these cemeteries, particularly the pioneer cemetery prairies. The pioneers were here settling Illinois in the mid 1800s, and those that died were often buried nearby in prairie land, and that area was set aside as sacred, never to be farmed and plowed or significantly altered. And so what these biologists found out, they went out the first day and they found 3 of these cemeteries harboring high quality prairie vegetation, and they went back and thought, well, at this rate there's no way we'll be able to visit all the cemeteries because it seems like so many of them seem to have high quality prairie plants present. However, it was a coincidence that they happened to find several of the higher quality vegetation left in some of these cemeteries that day. So Loda was one, just here. Prospect Cemetery just down the road was another one. And so they found out that, looking at some of these cemeteries, particularly the older ones, may have intact prairie vegetation present. So that's how this site was sort of brought on the radar of nature preservationists. And of course, the next idea was, well, let's try to acquire it so we can preserve it. And that happened through the 1980s, and it was kind of a complicated endeavor. Of course, a lot of people look at, unmowed areas and areas that aren't farmland as unproductive and full of weeds and those sorts of misconceptions. And so there was some skepticism of the people who own the prairie of, why do you want this land? What's really your true motives? Is they didn't understand necessarily why someone would pay so much money for such a small area just to preserve it. And basically, it's a long story, but to make the story short here, the Nature Conservancy decided to buy farmland adjacent to the cemetery to trade. The Cemetery Association wasn't interested in just selling the prairie. They were determined that burials were going to continue to occur
in this expanded, or this, area of the cemetery they hadn't used yet. And so they thought, well, if you just want land adjacent to the cemetery for burials, well, let's buy farmland and we'll trade it. And that ultimately is what ended up happening. But as you can imagine, convincing the board of directors at the Nature Conservancy to buy farmland, degraded, natural land, was a hard sell. Their Nature Conservancy was used to buying high quality land for preservation and habitat. But of course they understood that this would be a trade for the high quality piece that they wanted to obtain, and that's ultimately what happened. And now this site is an Illinois nature preserve, protected in perpetuity. So you can hear behind me now the fate of the prairie that used to occur in front of Loda, the Pine Ridge Cemetery. You hear weed whackers, you see the guy walking there. I happened to, plan my visit on the day when they're doing all their landscaping. But that is, of course, what is done in a lot of the cemeteries throughout Illinois. The prairie vegetation has been annihilated, and there's constant, mowing and trimming of plants. So that's going on, back over here where the burials are. But where I'm at here and behind the prairie, we can actually see the vegetation intact here. So it's a small site. I think it's about 5 acres or so, maybe smaller. And you can see, in the distance behind me here, Interstate 57 runs north-south, and you can see the traffic back there. So one of the things that's nice about traveling to this site, I often go from north to south. And so you can get off at Paxton if you're coming from the south, drive up Highway 45 to Loda, because there's no exit ramp at Loda, and then continue north on Highway 45 up to Buckley and continue your travels, and vice versa if you're coming from the north. And I'm standing here on a newly constructed viewing platform. Grand Prairie Friends manages the site, and they do excellent work with their volunteers and their staff. And they've constructed this viewing platform, so a lot of people can, and it's ADA accessible, so lots of people can come visit and look at this, truly priceless remnant example of a high quality tall grass prairie in Illinois. Some of the plants that I see here, we have lead plant, Amorpha canescens, tall Coreopsis, Coreopsis tripteris. I see flowering spurge, Euphorbia corolata, and of course there is prairie dock, Silphium terebinthinaceum, compass plant, Silphium laciniatum. I see Indian grass, Sargastrum nutans, big blue stem, Andropogon gerardii. Of course, there's a lot of Carolina rose, Rosa Carolina, strawberry, Fragaria virginiana, common here as well. I see switchgrass, Panicum virgatum. I see prairie drop seed, which is Sporobolus heterolepis. I see rosinweed, Silphium integrifolium, wild quinine, Parthenium integrifolium, mountain mint, Pycnathemum tenuifolium. I see heath aster, Symphiatricum ericoides, and I see Helianthus grossus serratus, the sunflower, and of course rattlesnake master, Euringium yuccifolium. I see round-headed bush clover, Lespedeza capitata, and white wild indigo bush, Baptisia alba, and one of the tall lettuces, Nebulus asper, and as you can see, quite a variety of things. And that's what makes this prairie high quality. We have conservative plant species, we have a diversity of plant species, the structure, how everything is distributed fairly evenly and not clumpy, that's high quality. We have lack of invasive species, and the site's being managed with prescribed fires. One of the really common and iconic plants of the tall grass prairie is this yellow flower here called prairie dock. And prairie dock has the scientific name of Silphium terebinthinaceum. And really there are several Silphium species in Illinois, and many of them find home on the prairie. So, interesting thing about this plant here We zoom in on some of these leaves. You see they're very large, broad, and the leaf is not attached to the stem, really, that has the flowers on it. Usually separate leaves come out of the ground, and if you touch them towards the base, they're cool to the touch. And that's basically because the plant has such a deep taproot that it goes so far down into the ground where it's pulling up water where things are more of a constant temperature and they're cold. So on a hot day, you hold those prairie dock leaves and feel that cool touch to them. You can also see that prairie dock has yellow flowers, or yellow ray flowers, and yellow disc flowers. Of course, it's in the Asteraceae, the composite family. And the composite flowers often are ray and disc flowers. And these have both. The ray flowers are around the periphery, and the disc flowers are in the center of the head. Collectively, you can call it an inflorescence or a flower head. Two types of flowers there for this one. So the prairie across much of central Illinois is called the tallgrass prairie. And that refers to two species that are a common component in the prairie land, and one is here called big blue stem, or sometimes turkey foot. You see the three separate spikes here. Okay, that's big blue stem, Andropogon girardii, and then this one here, Indian grass, which is Sorghastrum nutans, and they're pretty much about as tall as I am. A couple here that in this patch are taller than me. I'm about 6 feet tall. So that I would call that a tall grass for sure. And these are C4 photosynthesizers, meaning they're warm season grasses. They do a lot of their activity and growing later in the season when things are much warmer and photosynthesis is a little bit trickier. So they have special adaptations for that. And they're basically, two of the most common grasses on the tall grass prairie, and they're both quite beautiful. They do turn these purplish hue on the leaves and on the culms. So one of the aspects that makes a high quality tallgrass prairie is the presence of conservative species. So these are the species that are only found in remnant intact, undegraded natural communities. But this one here is called Nebulus asper, formerly in the genus Prenanthes. These are the tall white lettuces. And you know that you're in a high quality, central Illinois, northern Illinois prairie when you see the presence of Nebulus asper. And it's often, one of the more dominant plants on a high quality prairie. So it is in the composite family. It has only ray flowers though, no disc flowers, but they have these neat stamens where the anthers kind of curl back around. So you can see it's a pretty tall plant here, sticking above, the horizon there here at Lotus Cemetery Prairie. And it's one that I don't see very often. And you can see, even parts of the involucre here, they're fairly hairy. And that's one way to identify them. Of course, the lactucas also have milky sap. Let me hold it up here. You can see milky sap if you take a leaf off or inside the stem. So that's another helpful identification clue for this beautiful, stunning prairie plant.
There are many other conservative plant species that are indicative of a high-quality remnant prairie as well. Many of these plants are difficult to propagate and put back on the prairie landscape, which is one reason why conservative plants are often rare. Prairie gentian, Gentiana puberulenta, is a species only found in rich prairie soil. Other conservative plants with prairie in the name include prairie lily, Lilium philadelphicum variety andinum, and queen of the prairie, Philopendula rubra. Other plant species are truly rare in the prairie landscape and are listed as threatened and endangered in Illinois. These include Mead's milkweed, Asclepias meadii,
named after the frontier physician Samuel Meade, who made a huge contribution to botany in Illinois. It was found in a strip of prairie just north of the railroad tracks at present-day Palatine Prairie Nature Preserve in 1966, only to be bulldozed for more housing 3 weeks later. The Oklahoma grass pink orchid, Calopogon oklahomensis, was unknown to science until 1987, when Bill Summers noticed it in Missouri and it was described in 1995. It is extant in a single county in Illinois. Large-flowered beard's tongue, Penstemon grandiflorus, is a rare species of sand prairies and can only be found in 3 Illinois counties, although it is easy to grow and has been planted in prairies outside its range. Lastly, you will be among royalty when you find royal catchfly, Silene regia, with its deep red flowers and sticky calyx, hence the name. Although common in prairie restorations, there are very few intact sites in Illinois where this species occurs naturally.
So there's another aspect about Loda Cemetery Prairie that really demonstrates how well the site is being managed, and that is looking behind me here at this area, and this is a buffer around the preserve. So this was formerly farmland. It was purchased and it was seeded with prairie seed, presumably here collected at Loda, and just expanding the prairie out. Now, of course, it's very difficult to build a high quality tall grass prairie. I'm not saying it can't be done. There are limited examples of very small, very hard, working people to create these prairie landscapes where they are nearly indistinguishable from a natural area, but there aren't very many, and it takes a lot of hard work. So it's still useful, though, to not have farmland and herbicide spraying and weed growth occur on the edge of your high quality nature preserve. So if buffer areas can be obtained and enhanced, that's really the ideal thing to do, and that's what's been done here at Loda. And if you look at the high quality prairie and really pay attention to the structure of the vegetation and the diversity and species that are occurring there, you can see the differences. At a quick glance, it may look like it's pretty much the same in quality, but really it's dominated by Indian grass. And the Indian grass that I see, behind the camera here in the high quality prairie, they're very scattered about and they're not clumpy. And you see them for sure among all the other prairie plants, but here it's much more of a dense distribution. So there's some diversity, there's good prairie species, there's Baptisia alba, the white indigo and compass plants, and I see rattlesnake master and the tall coreopsis. So the same species are here and they're being put back, and that's good. But it's important to distinguish the difference between the high quality intact remnant prairie versus what we've had created here in the buffer area, that is an enhancement or a creation of prairie species playing a vital role and protecting the preserve basically from invasive species and weedy species from moving in from the adjacent farmlands and such. So it adds resiliency to the natural area. So now I'm kneeling down in the prairie and I'm holding rattlesnake master, another iconic prairie plant, the Illinois landscape. It's called Euringium yuccifolium, and that's because it has these leaves that similar to yucca. And if you are very fibrous, as you can see, you can shred them into strips. So they were used for weaving by natives. In fact, there's a really interesting story about this plant and Illinois, and that is down in Union County, the southern part of the state. There was a researcher studying pack rats, and he found in a pack rat nest a sandal, and he noted it in his report and then basically filed it away. And someone else came across the report, saw there was this textile found, a sandal-like object, and he had it tested, and turned out it was made from 5,000-year-old rattlesnake master fibers that were used to weave this sandal. So that is the oldest known textile in Illinois and really, that's pretty old for the entire North America as far as a textile artifact is concerned. So that's kind of a neat story about this plant. Also, rattlesnake master because it was believed to be a cure for rattlesnake bites. Of course, in central Illinois was once home to the once common Massasauga rattlesnake. Now almost, extirpated. There is a couple sites, one in particular, where there are a lot of them, but they've pretty much vanished from the prairie landscape. So perhaps it was Massasauga bite that this plant was, believed to ward off or cure. So that's an interesting story about the rattlesnake master. Definitely very iconic plant, very easy to recognize with these globose seed heads. And it is in the carrot family, the Apiaceae. So I'm here with a neat prairie grass called prairie drop seed, Sporobolus heterolepis. Of course, there's a lot of name changing going on right now with grasses and lots of other plants, but that's the name I learned this plant as. And you can see it's a clumper. There's a big clump here, radiating leaves off of this plant. I like to joke that when in the dormant season, when it goes, brown, the clumps sort of look like a bad toupee, or like Cousin It, from the Addams Family. So that's kind of funny. But also when it's flowering, like this is here, not lots of flowers here, I'll bring down. They have a really strong, sweet scent to them. Some people say they don't like it. I don't know. I think it smells pleasant. Other people say they think it smells like melted or buttered popcorn, and I definitely don't get that smell out of it. But it is fragrant and it is pleasant, and it's one that it's fairly easy to grow. I've often seen this plant in parking lot medians and things where it's just taking up the landscaping area and these nice clumps of full vegetation. So that's kind of neat to see because it is a rather conservative plant. I think it's a C-value 9, but it is a staple in the prairie, and you can see these big tufts growing out there. That's the prairie drop seed. I'm at Beach Cemetery Prairie Nature Preserve in Ogle County, and this site is owned by the Natural Land Institute, and it is a priceless remnant prairie that is a piece of the rich biological heritage of the prairie state of Illinois. And it's a dry prairie, so I see gray-headed coneflower and side oats grama-grass and lead plant, flowering spurge, rough blazing star. Got the small-flowered sunflower. We have short green milkweed, and lots of other, dry prairie species. And this is really a beautiful site here on a gently sloping hill, of course surrounded by farmland. This is where the Beach family was buried, hence the name Beach Cemetery. So it's really quite an awesome site here. Kind of pan around. See the dry prairie here out on this hot August afternoon. It's 92 degrees. But it is a beautiful spot.
I hope I've inspired you to visit a remnant prairie in Illinois, to marvel at its beauty, to appreciate its complexity, and perhaps to volunteer to protect it. In regard to high-quality cemetery prairies, there are 29 documented in Illinois.